I was 60 when my life tilted on its axis, though the morning had begun like any other. My name is Fiona Callahan, and I've spent most of my years quietly building a life of routine, raising my adopted son, Matthew, and my daughters, Isla and Zoe, in our modest Chicago townhouse. Practical, stubborn, fiercely independent, that's how friends would describe me. And after decades of balancing work, school runs, and household chaos, I like to think it was true. The phone rang just as I was pouring my third cup of coffee, the steam curling around my fingers like a warning. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting the school, a client, or perhaps one of Matthew's friends with another minor emergency. The name on the screen made me freeze. It can't be. Fiona Callahan, the voice said. Crisp and formal. This is Eleanor Davenport. Your son, your biological son, has asked to meet you. I dropped the mug. Coffee splattered across the counter, leaving dark rings on the wood. My heart hammered like a drum, and a cold rush swept through me. I barely remembered the adoption records I'd found decades ago. The fleeting thought that my child might still exist somewhere out in the world. But now, to hear it confirmed, and not just that he had become a billionaire, it felt impossible. Matthew bounded into the kitchen, alert and cheerful, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. Morning. Mom. Coffee. His voice cut through my panic with ordinary warmth, and I realized I had to ground myself. Behind him, Isla and Zoe tumbled in, bickering playfully over who got the last slice of toast. Their laughter, so familiar, tethered me to reality. I clutched the receiver again, hearing Eleanor's patient explanation. My son had grown into a man of immense wealth, influential in ways I had only ever glimpsed in newspapers and business magazines. My fingers trembled as I imagined him, a young man I had never held, thriving in a world of luxury while I had spent my life teaching, managing, and keeping my family afloat. I leaned against the counter, gripping it like it would anchor me through the storm of disbelief and curiosity. My adopted son nudged my arm gently, and my daughters crowded closer. Sensing something serious, I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of a reality that felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The morning passed in a blur of calls and preparations. Documents were faxed, schedules confirmed, and plans for our journey to Chicago began to take shape. As the sun climbed higher over the city skyline, I realized that, by evening, everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and life itself would be challenged. My mind raced, already stepping into a world I had never known. And so, with bags packed and hearts uncertain, we set our sights on Chicago, unaware that the reunion awaiting us would not unfold as anyone had imagined. Before the call, before the disbelief, my life had been ordinary in the way that only hard work can make it extraordinary. Raising Matthew, my adopted son, had been both my greatest challenge and my greatest joy. He came to me as a fragile newborn, a quiet little boy who trusted the world to me, and I had taken that responsibility with everything I had. Morning routines blurred into endless cycles of breakfast, school, and work. I balanced a part-time bookkeeping job with teaching piano lessons in the evenings, squeezing in homework help for Isla and Zoe between clients and late-night emails. There were nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table, arms still aching from carrying laundry, a baby, and the weight of all the responsibilities I had willingly claimed. I had no wealthy family to cushion mistakes or offer guidance. There was no inheritance waiting to cover unexpected bills. Every car repair, every school fee, every last piano sheet I bought had come from the money I earned and the sacrifices I made. And yet, In the quiet moments watching Matthew master a tricky piano piece, or Isla and Zoe laugh together in the living room, everything felt worthwhile. I taught them independence, but also empathy. Matthew learned to notice the small gestures that mattered: a note left on the fridge, a cup of tea set aside for someone too busy to make it themselves. Isla and Zoe grew in confidence, curious and bold, asking questions, challenging assumptions, learning to navigate the world with honesty and kindness. By the time they were teenagers, my children had inherited nothing of wealth, but they carried the values I had tried to instill: perseverance, loyalty, and respect. I had built a life from scratch, brick by brick, with my own hands and heart. And though it lacked glimmering luxury, it was a life rich with love, lessons, and purpose. As I glanced at Matthew helping Isla pack her backpack, the weight of what awaited me in Chicago pressed softly in my chest. My life had prepared me for many things, but nothing could have fully prepared me for the son I had never known, and the reunion that would challenge everything I had built. The highway stretched before us, steel and asphalt cutting through the outskirts of Chicago, as if leading straight into the unknown. I sat in the passenger seat, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest, trying to steady the churn of nerves in my stomach. Matthew drove calmly, offering quiet reassurance, while Isla and Zoe chattered in the back seat about skyscrapers and famous streets, their excitement infectious, yet tinged with tension. I thought about the decades I had lived, the routines, the small victories, the quiet sacrifices that had shaped my family. And now, in a few hours, everything might shift. The son I had never met, grown into a world of wealth and influence, waited for us. Would he recognize me as family or see me as an intruder? Passing the magnificent mile, I glimpsed storefronts gleaming with polished glass, luxury cars parked along curbs, and the kind of people who walked with purpose, dressed like they owned the world. This was a realm I had never inhabited. The contrast pressed against my chest: a life built on grit, love, and modest means colliding with one defined by privilege, power, and expectation. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle for a moment. My children fidgeted beside me, sensing the gravity without fully understanding it. Soon, we would arrive, stepping into a world that felt both dazzling and alien. And I knew that the first meeting could define everything that came next. Chapter 4. First Impressions. We arrived at the estate as the late afternoon sun gilded the skyline. The driveway curved around manicured gardens, fountains glinting, and luxury vehicles lined up perfectly. My daughter's eyes widened, and even Matthew let out a low whistle. I gripped the steering wheel a moment longer, letting the reality sink in before stepping out. A uniformed butler approached, bowing slightly. "Mrs. Callahan, welcome," he said politely, though measured, as if testing me. Behind him, staff observed silently, sharp gazes evaluating every movement. In this world, even small gestures carried meaning. The first to appear were my son's siblings, polished and impeccable. Andrew nodded politely, masking skepticism, while Camille smiled sweetly, her eyes questioning, weighing my intentions against years of assumption. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just a meeting. It felt like an audition I hadn't prepared for. Then he appeared. My son, tall, composed, the picture of privilege and upbringing. His eyes swept over me, curiosity hardening into assumption. "So, this is what this is about," he said lightly, voice neutral, but edged with suspicion. "You came for support." The words hit like stones. I shook my head slightly, unwilling to reveal anything yet. aware that a misstep could confirm his preconceptions. Isla and Zoe watched closely, sensing tension, hierarchy, and nuance. They had never seen me navigate such an alien environment and caught every glance, gesture, and expression. I straightened, taking a slow breath. My worth wasn't measured by wealth, but by the life I'd built and the children I'd raised. This world of polished facades and scrutiny would not intimidate me, not entirely. As the estate doors opened and we were led into the grand hall, I felt the weight of assumptions pressing down, every gleaming surface reflecting expectations I had never sought. The air inside the estate was heavy with unspoken rules. Every gesture, every glance seemed to carry a hidden meaning. My son's eyes never left me, calculating, cautious, convinced that my presence was less about reunion and more about leverage. When I reached for a glass of water, he raised a brow, and I felt the weight of his suspicion press down as though it were tangible. "So, you're here for financial reasons?" he asked, voice calm but sharp. I forced a polite smile and shook my head. But the accusation lingered like smoke in the room. Andrew and Camille exchanged subtle looks, each silently measuring me against decades of assumed propriety. Staff lingered in the background, courteous yet vigilant, adding a quiet pressure that made the room feel like a stage where every misstep would be noticed. Even the paintings on the walls, the carefully arranged vases, seemed to mock me with their perfection. My daughters, Isla and Zoe, picked up on the tension immediately. They watched each facial twitch, every half-smile or glance, noting the difference between this world and our own home. They whispered softly between themselves, eyes wide, reading the unspoken rules as clearly as if they had been taught them. I felt my heart tighten, frustration coiling in my chest. Every polite word I spoke seemed misinterpreted, every gesture considered a subtle maneuver. I wanted to correct him, to insist that I had no interest in his wealth, that my life was rich in ways money could never measure. Yet I knew that confrontation now could make matters worse, that patience and restraint were my only allies. The tension became almost tangible as minor incidents compounded. A staff member gave an extra curious glance. A sibling's laugh carried an edge that wasn't meant for humor. A toast misdirected with polite obligation rather than warmth. Each layer of misjudgment built atop the last, creating a web of assumptions that threatened to entangle us all. I took a steadying breath, reminding myself to remain composed. Inside, however, a quiet storm raged: frustration, disbelief, and the simmering knowledge that my presence was misread at every turn. The stakes were higher than ever, and I knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond the grand hall, the path toward clarity and confrontation was waiting, ready to test our patience, our courage, and the bonds we had yet to prove. The tension in the room was suffocating, every smile and polite nod feeling like a test I had no way to pass. And then, without warning, Matthew stepped through the double doors, my adopted son, grown now into a tall, steady presence, carried the kind of calm confidence that immediately shifted the air. He gave me a brief, reassuring nod before his gaze swept the room, landing squarely on my billionaire son. "Sorry I'm late," Matthew said lightly, his voice casual but edged with authority. "Traffic, you know how it is." The billionaire son blinked, caught off guard by the sudden arrival. He had been certain he understood the situation, Fiona's motives, her intentions, and suddenly, the narrative shifted. Matthew's calm, unflappable demeanor and subtle wit challenged every assumption the man had made. Matthew didn't confront anyone aggressively. Instead, He offered small, pointed observations that highlighted the absurdity of the suspicions. "I see you've been busy judging the wrong person," he said with a half smile, as if stating the obvious. Laughter rippled under his controlled tone, soft but undeniable, and I felt a spark of relief light inside me. The room's energy shifted almost imperceptibly. Where once every glance and gesture weighed heavily against me, now there was space and opening for clarity and understanding. I straightened, feeling my own confidence return in tandem with Matthew's quiet support. The assumptions that had pressed down like bricks began to loosen, and for the first time since our arrival, I sensed possibility. My children, Isla and Zoe, exchanged glances, their eyes wide with excitement and relief. They understood instantly that Matthew's presence had changed everything, not by force, but by revealing the truth beneath the tension. And as I watched him stand there, a steady anchor amidst the scrutiny, I realized that the hardest part was behind us. The conversation we had avoided, the judgment we feared, could now unfold in a space reshaped by honesty and loyalty. The room had grown heavy with quiet tension, the kind that presses against your chest and refuses to be ignored. My billionaire son leaned back slightly, eyes narrowed, as if bracing for confirmation of every assumption he had made. I stepped forward, letting Matthew move beside me like a shield and an ally, ready to intervene if the situation spiraled further. "I didn't come for your money," I said steadily, meeting his gaze. "I came because you're my son. That's the only reason." My voice carried more weight than I expected, but it didn't falter. The words hung in the air, a challenge to every misconception, every judgment he had carried in silently. Andrew and Camille exchanged startled glances, their politeness faltering as they realized their assessments had been premature. The staff lingered tensely, unsure how the dynamics might shift now. My daughters, Isla and Zoe, stayed close, their expressions sharp, alert, and unwavering. They had inherited my resolve. The billionaire son's face tightened, the conflict within him apparent. "But," I thought, he began, only to have Matthew interrupt softly, yet firmly. "Assumptions rarely reflect reality," he said. "You judged her on appearances and old stories, not on the woman standing in front of you now." A hush fell over the room as the weight of truth sank in. I could feel a subtle shift in the energy. The oppressive judgment that had been suffocating me began to loosen. For the first time, the family could see me as I truly was capable, principled, and self-reliant. I didn't flinch, didn't bow, and didn't apologize for existing outside their expectations. Questions, doubts, and old resentments surfaced in fragments from the siblings. Each remark, each probing glance, was met with calm clarity. Matthew interjected where needed, gently steering the conversation toward understanding rather than escalation. Slowly, assumptions unraveled, intentions clarified, and the truth of my life, my choices, my sacrifices, my integrity was laid bare. By the end of the exchange, the tension had not evaporated entirely, but it had transformed. The air felt lighter, more honest, and more balanced. I stood firm, the culmination of decades of resilience, while my children and Matthew offered silent affirmation. The first cracks in misunderstanding had appeared, and with them, the path toward reconciliation and genuine connection became possible. The tension that had weighed so heavily began to dissolve as my son's gaze softened. He studied me, really looked, and for the first time, the suspicion that had shadowed every gesture and word lifted slightly. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. stripped of the edge that had made our first interactions feel like a trial. Matthew gave me a subtle nod, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had guided the conversation with care, letting truth speak louder than accusation. And now the shift was palpable. The siblings' expressions, though cautious, mirrored the change. They began to see me not as an interloper, but as a woman who had lived a life of integrity and quiet strength. Isla and Zoe, standing beside me, exchanged glances, their sharp eyes noting the transformation in the room. They had learned to recognize respect, courage, and authenticity early, and now they saw those qualities reflected in both me and the tentative acknowledgement from their half-brother. The wealth, the polished floors, and the curated appearances mattered less than the honesty and steadfastness that had guided our family through years of challenge. The billionaire son stepped closer, a gesture both formal and hesitant. "I underestimated what you've done, what you've built," he said, finally acknowledging the sacrifices and successes of a life forged outside his world. I allowed a small, controlled smile, feeling the tension ease, though not entirely vanish. There were still unspoken questions and lingering skepticism, but a foundation for connection had been laid. In that moment, I realized that recognition was more than words. It was respect, empathy, and an openness to understanding a life lived on different terms. The first step toward genuine family alignment had been taken, fragile but real, and as we moved forward together, I could feel the subtle beginnings of trust, curiosity, and perhaps even shared pride weaving through the room. Over the next few days, the rigid formality of the reunion gradually softened. My daughters, Isla and Zoe, moved through the billionaire son's world with a mixture of curiosity and confidence, navigating conversations with staff, siblings, and even business associates with ease. I watched them adapt, not by mimicking privilege, but by staying true to the values we had always cherished: honesty, empathy, and humor. Matthew remained a quiet anchor, offering insight when tensions threatened to flare. He guided interactions with a gentle hand, bridging the divide between the world we had known and the one we had entered. Observing him, I realized how much influence a single presence, rooted in loyalty and understanding, could have in transforming relationships. I noticed subtle shifts in my son as well. He began to ask questions not about money or status, but about our lives, our experiences, and the lessons that had shaped us. The arrogance that had shadowed our first meeting softened into genuine interest. The siblings, too, relaxed, laughter appearing more easily and judgments falling away as they encountered the people we truly were for the first time. I could see our worlds blending, not perfectly, and not without occasional awkwardness, but authentically. Wealth and privilege no longer felt like barriers. They were simply a context in which new bonds could form. Respect and understanding were earned through honesty and integrity, not assumed by inheritance or status. As the sun set over Chicago, I felt a warmth settle in my chest. The tension that had weighed so heavily during our arrival had given way to cautious optimism. Bridges were being built, small and steady. And in the laughter of my daughters and the tentative smiles of my son and his siblings, I sensed a shared acknowledgement family was more than blood. It was effort, trust, and the choice to meet each other with openness and care. I stood on the balcony of our Chicago rental apartment, the city lights sparkling like a mirror of the life I had built. The reunion was behind us, and for the first time in decades, I felt fully in control of my story. My son's world, with all its wealth and expectations, no longer intimidated me. I had proven quietly and firmly, that my worth was measured by integrity, love, and the life I had raised. Matthew, Isla, and Zoe lounged nearby, laughing over small inside jokes, a comforting reminder of the family we had nurtured. I realized that dignity wasn't about recognition from others, it was about standing firm in your choices, protecting those you love, and refusing to be defined by assumptions or inherited privilege. Over the next weeks, we balanced visits with my billionaire son, conversations that were candid but calm, and the steady rhythms of our everyday life. Friendships and connections formed naturally, without compromise or pretense, bridging the gap between our worlds while honoring our own. As I watched my children asleep that night, I understood that true power lay not in wealth or influence, but in the freedom to live authentically, to claim your place, and to embrace both the family you have and the family you discover. In that quiet certainty, I found closure, satisfaction, and hope, a life reclaimed with grace and resilience.